focusing on the role of international financing in Africa's development. Please join me in welcoming to the stage the chair of the panel, Bilal, Senior Executive and Associate Director of Sustainable Economies and Climate Action Cluster, European Center for Development Policy Management. And now, please welcome to the stage the speakers for this session, François Bourguignon, Emeritus Professor, Paris School of Economics. Erik Berglof, Chief Economist, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Andrew Dabalen, Africa Region Chief Economist, World Bank Group. Richard Kozul-Wright, Director of the Division on Globalization and Development Strategies, UN Trade and Development. Before giving the floor to the chair for this session, we will view a short introductory video for the panel.
Africa is facing pressing financial needs to reach its development goals. This situation is exacerbated by elevated levels of debt and risks of debt distress, consequential to the duplication of shocks since the COVID-19 pandemic. This includes financial conditions that have kicked many African countries out of international markets. Due to this situation, international financial institutions are called to step up their game and increase the scale of their intervention. However, under the current configuration, these institutions appear to be unequipped to face the looming challenges of the 21st century. The multilateral development bank system is lacking the required size to provide more funding to development projects and deliver on public goods. How can the global financial architecture be reformed to be fit for purpose? What challenges impede efficient debt restructuring, and what mechanisms can be adopted to enhance its efficiency? What role can the African Development Bank play in the new financial architecture?
Bilal, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. Let me start by thanking first the Policy Center for the New South, and in particular Karim and his team for inviting me to be part of this very fascinating conference and to have the pleasure to moderate this prestigious panel. It's also especially nice for me because I come from Brussels, where I'm quite often, when we're discussing about the international financial architecture, it's quite often within what is the role of Europe. So I'm especially happy not to have a European representative on the panel to have these kind of discussions and to be really international. In fact, if we're thinking about, after the discussion we were having on the role of domestic resource mobilization, how to mobilize domestic finance, of course the role of international finance is also very important. And in that sense, this panel is an opportunity to reflect on where we are and where we want to go in terms of the role of international finance. Let's remember that, in 2015, when we adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, the agenda in terms of finance, the MDBs came and very loudly proclaimed that the challenge was so big that we needed to mobilize from billion to trillions. And now we're almost, of course, 10 years down the line. I think nobody hopes or expects to manage to mobilize trillions. So the ambitions are probably lower. And in that sense, of course, for many of us who had perhaps high expectations in 2015, it is a disappointment. But on the other hand, we see also MDBs and the international financial architectures that is being questioned, that is being thinking about what to do in a different manner, how to change some of our business model, how can we operate in different manners. And that is something that is, of course, we should all rejoice about. And I think we will discuss what are some of the elements that are coming. I just want to stress perhaps two dimensions that we should pay attention to. One is that we have seen, of course, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the following crisis, that in fact we live in a world that is very different from the world we had in the past. In the past, there was a tendency, especially in finance, to have a crisis every decade. There would be a crisis, and then there was this shock, and then is the question: how do we cope with the shock? Well, right now are in a situation that, in fact, we have a multiplicity of crises that seem to happen at the same time and almost in a permanent basis. So, in fact, one of the questions for the financial architecture and also in particular for the MDBs is the model that was used before, that you have one shock and then how to be counter-cyclical and respond to one shock, and then you go back to the normal until you wait for the next shocks. When you have a multiplicity of shocks and a higher uncertainty, one of the questions is of international financial architectures, in particular the MDBs, are they fit to operate in such a world? And that's perhaps for one aspect of the business model. The other dimension is we come from a part where the focus was really on how to finance development. And now, of course, there is also another question, which is how to finance our response to climate change. So both to have a greener energy and how to have climate adaptation, which is grossly underfinanced, as we realize, especially on this continent. So there is a tendency to think that these are two aspects of the same dimension, but others are also arguing that there are trade-offs. And so how to best articulate these additional needs for finance for both developments and climate, so that they to identify the synergies so that they can be reinforcing one another instead of undermining one or having this trade-off that we have to decide that we finance climate at the expense of social expenditures or transformation is really another second challenge that I wanted to highlight. But that's more than enough for my introduction. I would suggest that you take your interactive apps, and we have a word cloud, and so if you go under the interactive dimensions, the questions we wanted to ask is what is the biggest financing challenge for Africa? And if you could identify just that in one word, and then we'll see some of the challenges that perhaps we have to address also on this panel. So please take your app and vote. The ones putting the first words are highlighted initially. So we see familiar words: youth, employment, debt, risk, climate, infrastructure, dependency. Risk seems to be the one of the words that is the most often referred, which perhaps refers to my introductory remarks about uncertainties. So let's turn to Professor Bourguignon. If you allow me, I'll just call you with your first name. That will make it a bit more friendly. So, François, it's a pleasure to have you there. What are some of your perspectives on the role of international finance for development?
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I enjoyed very, very much all those sessions since yesterday. Initially, I thought that I would be talking as this introductory video mentioned it about the debt. But because we already heard a lot about the debt since yesterday, I thought that I would make my remarks on something slightly different, which may be a kind of newcomer in development finance, and which most likely will affect the architecture of development finance in the decades to come. And this is essentially climate finance. So to make sure that we understand the amplitude of the problem of climate, when you look at the total cost of all the mitigation and adaptation measures that were included in the so-called national defined contributions, which were proposed after the Paris COP in 2015, then you realize that the total cost of those expenditures is $8 trillion for the whole world, which is more or less 8% of global GDP. Then when you go to developing countries, in general they exclude China, which is such a big actor, then of course the amount is much reduced. It's only 2 trillion, only 2 trillion. And we're talking about annual expenditures. We're not talking about having to spend that over a period of 10 years. Every year until 2030, and probably a little more later on. Then people consider that out of this, half of this amount should be, or could be, covered by domestic actors, by the private sectors, in particular FDI, which means that the international finance system should provide the remaining trillion. And when you relate that to GDP in those countries, we're talking about something like 3 to 4% of GDP. So the point is that the total amount of finance provided by the international community to developing countries should be increasing from something like a little less than 1% to something like 4%. In Africa, this would mean coming from today, ODA over GDP is slightly below 2% of GDP, then we should move to something like 5% of GDP. For advanced countries, this means that ODA, which represent today 0.3% of their GDP, should move to something slightly above 1%. And what is interesting is that we find this iconic figure, which is a 1%, which has been so often considered as a normal contribution of advanced countries to global development. So this is the need. Now, let's assume, and this is a big if probably, that we are able to get this commitment by advanced countries, by the community, in order to provide this kind of finance. What are the problems that we may be facing? And this is where the architecture will come into play. First thing, we like to make sure that this money will be additional. It will not be a substitution. And unfortunately, when we look at the beginning of climate finance, which is a commitment made back in 2009 by advanced countries to provide to developing countries an amount of $100 billion every year from 2020 on. First, they made it, but it was only in 2022 that this figure was reached. But when you look at the total amount of aid provided by those countries, by DAC countries in the OECD, and you take out of this special expenditures which have become quite important lately to cover the costs of refugees in advanced countries. First Syria, then of course Ukraine. When you take out the direct aid to Ukraine in 2022, then you realize that the real value of the total aid provided by advanced countries has not changed at all since 2009, and even probably it has declined. What does that mean? This means that the 100 billion which were provided to finance climate has been taken away from the existing development finance. And the point I'm trying to make here is that it will become more and more important in the future to make a distinction between development finance, the old official development assistance, and climate finance. Why should we make that distinction? And this, if we do it, will modify the architecture of the international or global finance. One reason, first, is that we want to make sure that there is additionality. So if we have two funds, then we know that it will not be possible to take from one fund to put it in the other. So this will be guaranteeing additionality. Second reason, the motivation behind those two types of flows are different. One is assistance, aid, development aid, and we know what is behind that, and we know why it is important. The other one is a global public good. And this is an expenditure that is benefiting everybody in the planet, which means that the philosophy of this transfer is completely different. And because of that, we cannot put together two types of flows which obey different type of motivations. And the third reason that I believe that it is important to make a distinction between those two groups, or two types of finance, is the way in which they are monitored or managed. We have rules to allocate in any advanced country, any multilateral agency. There are rules to allocate aid across countries. The rules to allocate aid, climate finance, will be different. The rules will be based on precisely what those countries reported in their national contributed, national defined contribution as the needs for mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And because of that, we cannot have the same rules to allocate the two types of aid, and this is quite important. By the way, I also forgot to mention that there is another fund which just appeared, as a matter of fact, last year in the COP28, which is a loss and damage fund, which is another pot of money which should be created in order to compensate developing countries for damages that can be clearly caused or attributed to climate change. Hello?
No.
This is...
It's not me.
Fine, okay. But sometimes the red light goes on, so, okay, but, so let me finish. I mean, I have only for a few minutes. Okay, so this is the reason why we will have to distinguish the two types of flows. There is another one, or another issue, which I think is quite important, and this is getting us back to the issue of the debt, which is what will be the form of that money. I mean, if the community is to provide so much money to developing countries, multiplying by 3 or 4 the flows which do exist, what will be the form of that, those transfers? Grants or concessional loans? It is most likely that it will be under the form of concessional loans, basically because advanced countries will prefer to provide loans than to provide grants. And on such a scale, we can understand that this will be necessarily the case. But then, this may be introducing debt problems, because if a country is receiving every year, let's say, in addition to what was the case before, 2% of GDP as a new loan, and this new loan with a very long maturity, this means that the indebtedness of the country will be increasing systematically every year by 2%. I mean, the debt over GDP ratio will be increasing by 2%. And this means that in order for this debt to be sustainable, it will be necessary to have the rate of growth of the economy, of GDP, to increase. And then we get into an important issue, which I think is really central to all this reflection on climate finance, which is it the case that this investment, which will be made for adaptation and for mitigation, is it the case that those investments will be accelerating growth? Is it the case that they will be contributing to development in the sense of an increase in income per capita? And my point here is to say, I'm not sure. We can say that what we spend on adaptation is compensating for possible losses that would be implied by climate change. So this is not changing growth. This is maintaining the rate of growth where it is. If we think about mitigation, mitigation is about substituting a technology for, in particular, energy production into another. But it is a substitution. This is not necessarily increasing or implying more infrastructure. It is implying a different type of infrastructure, which is something which is slightly different. So the fact we are not clear about the way in which this money will be managed or could be managed, but a priori to say that there will be faster growth because of that in African countries as in other developing countries, low income and lower middle income countries, I think it is really something that has to be seen. And then the final point is that today we have all those countries, in particular in Africa, which are in debt distress. And if more money goes to those countries, then those countries will say, okay, we'll use this money to get rid of our debt constraint. But then, if they do that, this money will not go to adaptation or to mitigation. And there is an issue there on the side of the donors who may say, okay, but we are not giving money to release those countries from their debt constraint. We want to give money to finance the overall the fight against climate change. So now, I believe that this is not an issue that will come tomorrow. Because unfortunately, I believe that it will take time before we get this new architecture of climate finance on the one hand, development finance on the other together. And this means that the debt issue in African countries, as in some other part of the world, has to be resolved as quickly as possible in order to reestablish the growth potential of those countries. But I think that thinking about climate finance, the damage that can be created by climate change, the need to invest in adaptation and in mitigation in the decade to come will be very much affecting the way in which we think about development and the way in which we think about the architecture of global finance to help development. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me just play 1 minute before I give the floor to the other panelists, the devil advocate. You are saying that one should distinguish between development finance and climate finance. Now, in Africa, there is a huge need to have investment for access to increase access to energy, both for the populations and for industrializations. So when you do energy and decide to do green energy, are you doing climate mitigation or are you doing developments? If you're trying to do industrializations and you decide that for economic transformation in Africa, you decide that the way for the future to be competitive is to have a more green type of industrialization than to have a brown industrialization. It's good for the development, it is creating employment, it is good for the employment. It is good for the environment. Are you doing climate finance or are you doing development finance? How do you answer to that question? And just very quickly, the second one is ODA, because you're saying that basically grants should be adopted, but in the current political climates that we see in many donors countries, is that the expectations that grants will be increased is, it seems to be utopia. So would that mean that we're condemned to not address no climate finance and development finance?
Okay, so on your first question, the issue is the way in which the needs of a country have been defined in the national defined contribution. If you invest in a new solar plant, then you're right to say that this is a development investment because you are providing energy to people who didn't have energy before. Now, the way in which the development finance or the need for resources should have been defined in the national defined contribution was to say what is the additional cost that creating solar plants will imply, instead of providing electricity with a coal plant or with a gas plant. So now the problem is that, and this is the reason why we have to take all those figures with very much caution, is that, of course, in the national defined contribution, most countries played the game, trying to increase as much as possible the amount that would be needed. I mean, we all have played this kind of a game at some stage. We ask for very much, hoping to get something, and more than a little. So because of that, you're right, but we have to make sure that there is this distinction that I just made, saying, okay, the climate is requiring a change, a substitution of technology. On the second point, sure, I mean, we agree with the fact that grants will not be extended as it would be implied by the kind of order of magnitude that I've mentioned, which means that we have to get into concessional loans. But the problem is that there is a limit to the amount of concessional loans that we can provide.
Great, thank you very much. Erik, you are the chief economist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. You saw that in the word clouds, infrastructure came as one of the main challenges for finance in Africa. So you seem to be very well placed. Also, this is a rather new bank, so perhaps in terms of adopting in new approaches, and you have been quite innovative also as a bank. What do you see as the way forward? And perhaps as a parenthesis, I mean, you're the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, but you're also active in Africa, or what do you do in Africa?
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Karim and his team for inviting me. I'm a newcomer. I've worked quite a bit in North Africa, but Sub-Saharan Africa is really not a place that I know very well. So for me, it's been amazingly productive to be here over these last couple of days, and enjoyed both the seminars, but also very much the conversations in the fringes of the seminar and over dinner and so on. So thank you for that. So I'm actually going to pick up, I think actually François teed up my presentation, because I'm going to make the argument that yes, I do acknowledge that there are trade-offs here, but I also think one could think of this as a unique opportunity to really accelerate growth in Africa, and not only in Africa, but in general, thinking about what the opportunities that climate finance and also, I would say, nature finance, I'll come to that later. So it's clear that the net zero transition is not happening at the pace that we need, and Africa has not really been part of creating this problem, but Africa is very vulnerable to the consequences of climate change and needs a lot of adaptation finance in particular, and we know how difficult that is to finance. But the argument I'm going to make here is that you can use mitigation and also, I would say, nature opportunities or investing in nature as infrastructure to attract external capital and really make use of this. So I'm looking at the sort of upside of this, and I've used this notion, which is familiar to most of you, the sort of moonshot vision, that you take this now as a way to try to build a new type of economy, very much in the spirit that you were sort of alluding to. And I'm going to make the argument that what needs to be done for this to happen is not so different from the traditional development agenda. It's about strengthening state capacity, is about enabling and crowding in the private sector, and I'll come back with more specific in a minute. But really the argument here is this is an opportunity to get more financing into Africa, and looking at what kind of economy can we create in Africa based on that. So I call it sort of net zero moonshot for the emerging world, but you think of Africa, but I think it applies much more general. So a couple of years ago, we looked at what is the exposure of particularly state-owned institutions, both enterprises and and state-owned financial institutions to fossil fuels. And it is very clear that across the world, and also in Africa, these institutions, the state-owned enterprises and state-owned financial institutions, are overexposed, heavily overexposed to fossil fuel. So we need to look at, where has these institutions been transformed, and how did it happen, and how can we make them get a stake in developing this new economy. And so they really need to become leaders rather than laggards. The private sector obviously has much to contribute and must contribute, and of course you need to create the kind of conditions that brings out the good sides of the private sector. So how do you do that? These technologies now, very much, I live in Beijing now, I see how it has transformed the Chinese economy, and how, if you look at the streets of Beijing, for example, it's almost half electric vehicles now. And this is obviously it's about solar, it's about wind, it's about battery technologies. There are a lot of opportunities. I understand that's now a very significant investment in battery technologies in Morocco, for example. And I think this is something that we really need to think about. How can we support economies that want to come into these value chains? How can we work with the companies that are present in this sector? We need a meaningful carbon price. I know this is very controversial because of the distributional consequences. We need to find other ways of compensating those that are vulnerable here. But the carbon price is not only important to send signal to consumers and producers, but it's also very important for encouraging the new technologies and bringing them into the economy. It's more about adoption than genuine new innovation, but it's very important that this is part of an industrial policy, if you want. And the carbon price will not be sufficient. You need a lot of sort of mission-driven coordination, and this is, I think, where the international system comes in. I will come to that in just a second. And of course, I mean, it doesn't need to be said, but it's very important that this is done in a sustainable way, from a political and social point of view. So we need to think very carefully about the distributional impact of this. So just here is just an example of why we should care about this. So the trust in government comes very much from the ability to respond to environmental pressure. So I can, again, coming back to my Chinese experience, what has been achieved in terms of the quality of air in Beijing is truly remarkable. And that has been very much the driver of change, and that has built trust in the ability of government to respond. So I think this is something that we need to look at. How can we create this kind of what we call common interest society, where we really bring in the trust element. So I was going to give you an example now of what I'm talking about, and this is something that many of you are familiar with, the so-called NUEFI, with these country platform. This is very much the hot topic of debate internationally. The Brazilian G20 is doing a lot on trying to make this more specific and make it a more useful tool. But why is it important? Because this is where this international system is sort of manifests itself in an individual country. So if we cannot collaborate as MDBs and working with the DFIs, working with the IMF, if we cannot do that in the context of an individual country, the system is not working as a system. And that's really where I think this example that I want to talk about now is a very good illustration. Because what did the Egyptian government do? Well, ahead of their COP28 presidency, or 27 presidency, they went to put their pipeline of solar and wind. As you know, Egypt has a lot of potential in this space. They put their pipelines on this platform, and they said, all these MDBs, DFIs, this is what we plan to do. you talk among yourself and look at which project you want to be involved in. They, in parallel, created this program for phasing out fossil fuels and really emphasizing the just transition, how to redeploy, retrain, maybe some early retirement, bringing the fossil fuel assets out of the energy system. And they used the partner with EBRD, AIB, EIB. It was very much a partnership, but it was very important. It was driven by the Egyptians. It's a country-owned, country-led, and they looked for this opportunity. I think this is critical when we see how to push the country platforms going forward. So they managed to get concessional finance from the US for this phasing out of fossil fuels, which I think, again, these programs that were developed will be very helpful in getting out of that part of getting those assets out of the economy. They got innovative, we talked about innovative finance here, but they had a performance-linked debt instrument with Germany, which was linked to Egypt's contribution under the national determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And they committed to ratcheting up their engagement there. And if they failed, they would pay one interest rate. If they succeed, they would pay another interest rate, lower interest rate. And I think this is a way for countries that are serious about building this new economy and sending these signals. They can do it in a credible way, and I think this is something we can learn from. And then very importantly, so I've talked about this as sort of an industrial policy, a moonshot policy. What happened is that, because Egypt showed that they were committed and they were working with the international development partners, they now attracting FDI in this value chain. So there's a wind or blade manufacturer for wind now establishing itself in a German company in Egypt. And I think it's just one example of how we can think of this going forward. So maybe maybe I say. Sorry. Anyhow, no, just maybe let me, come to the final slide. No, it doesn't, sorry.
Perhaps do it without PowerPoint if you don't need to illustrate.
Yeah, no, so I just wanted to come to the final thing around the multilateral development banks, because this is now, I've been working in this system for 20 years or so, on and off, and this is the first time I see that there is real change. And I think there is a very important role, so I talked about this in the country platform, but there's a whole system now that's transforming. And of course, these MDBs can provide more patient capital, can help de-risk by managing risk, by maybe absorbing some of the risk on their own balance sheets. They can mobilize the private sector. I think this will be incredibly important. They can be part of building state capacity in this space. Very important, a lot of now new form of lending, climate policy-based financing will be very important going forward. And support these policy moonshots to help develop these green industrial policies, supporting the new financial instrument and risk transfer. And very importantly, this is where I want to end, is that we are trawling now, and François was emphasizing this, very large amounts of money. If this is going to happen in a way that builds up new FX exposures in these economies, that is going to be something holding back these developments. So we really need to find ways for the MDBs to jointly work to supply local currency finance, particularly for infrastructure. Word Cloud talked about infrastructure and risk. And of course, the Achilles heel of infrastructure is that it earns revenues in local currency, but it's often financed in foreign currencies. We need to find ways, and we have been working on a proposal to have the MDBs jointly provide, and working with the DFIs to help provide local currency and also help develop the local capital market. So I think this agenda, hopefully, it can give it a little bit more of optimism and looking at the upside of climate finance in Africa. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Erik. Can I just, before you stop the microphone, ask you one question, perhaps connecting this. The previous panel was about domestic finance, and this one is on international finance. But if you could say one word about the role of the non-financial additionality of MDBs, and in particular how they can help create this capacity, this domestic capacity you were talking about, capital markets formation, that then will help to demonstrate what is bankable and that what can be done afterwards at the domestic level. Could you give us perhaps a couple of examples or insights from your experience either at AIIB or EBRD?
So I'll give you two examples, one from the real sector, so to say, and one from the finance side. So on the real sector side, so I mentioned this relatively new. I mean, the World Bank has been doing this for many years, but I think as a specialty, sort of climate policy-based financing is relatively new as a concept, and I think that is. You were talking about transferring a lot of renewable technologies, but these renewable technologies don't exist in a vacuum. They have to be integrated with grids. They have to have regulatory policies associated with them. All that policy support, and I talked about these moonshots. For me, this is all part of the same kind of policy environment that really makes sure that these resources are used these technologies are used in the right context, and also benefits have spillovers to local manufacturing. So I think that's the climate policy-based financing is a very good tool for helping to build that environment, and also providing the context in which the private sector can participate. On the financial side, I mentioned this collaboration, working, and Hans-Peter, who is here, has also been involved in this, trying to find a way to use the fact that some MDBs have been more successful than others in working with local currency and helping to develop local capital markets. EBRD, my former institution, has worked with this in a lot of countries in former Eastern Europe, but now also in North Africa. And I think one concept there is what you call a currency pool. When you local currency, you have a pool that you develop over time, and within that pool you let losses and profits net out over time, and that's been for EBRD a very profitable business. What I think could happen here is to allow the MDBs to work together and also bring in DFIs. DFIs can never really provide local currency finance. It's a very specialized activity. So I think in both those respects, helping to develop, offer local currency, but also work with governments to develop these local capital markets, working with the IMF and the World Bank, have a long experience of this. So I think that is, to me, a very substantive role for the MDBs.
Thank you very much. Andrew, you have fantastic insights from the World Bank perspectives and from your own career in this field. What are your views on the role of international finance and how to improve on the way forward?
Thank you. So this is my first time to be in Morocco, so I'm really delighted to be here. I participated in the inaugural AES, actually, virtually, but it's a lot nicer to be here. So thank you for organizing this and to have these incredible, intellectually stimulating and fascinating conversations. So what are my views? Well, as a side comment, I'm very skeptical about this idea of labeling a dollar brown or green, but that's a debate we can have.
Why are you skeptical?
No, I would. We can come back to that. But I want to set the context a little bit about the fact that it is absolutely clear that this continent needs transformation, right? So that's the subject matter here. And a lot of people have talked about the importance of growth for that transformation. And so I think maybe it's worth noting that for the last 60 years of independence, and this is, forgive me, mostly my knowledge about sub-Saharan Africa, but it probably is possibly true for North Africa as well. The African region has been a low growth region for 60 years. Not the last, people talk about the last 10 years that have been a lost decade and another lost decade that was in the 80s or something. But in general, even if you take any decade you take on average, the continent in per capita terms have not grown more than 3%, less than 3% in per capita terms. That's one problem. Far worse is that it's been very volatile. So you have a decade of less than 2% growth, followed by another decade or 15 years of 0 or negative growth, then a recovery to 2% growth. And so it's been incredibly difficult to have transformation. And so that's why the continent is basically characterized by high poverty, high inequality, okay? Very low levels of employment creation, and therefore no transformation. So the continent fundamentally needs a new growth model. Now we can have a conversation about what that growth model should be. Maybe next AES conference should be about what's the new growth model for Africa. A suggestion, unsolicited. But definitely we need one. But fundamentally what we need is real change in the composition of investments. Okay? And what those investments right now have been difficult to come by. Public investments are now really constrained for the last 10, 15 years because of debt and all the crises that everyone has kind of noted. FDI has been declining, and there's no trend reversal yet. Okay? Domestic private investments is constrained because of high interest rates, right? Financial markets have completely closed out African countries, and the few that have been able to be successful are finding it extremely costly, right? So, Cote d'Ivoire, Benin, Kenya went to the market recently. I think Senegal also issued something recently. And they're all being quoted extremely high interest rates, right, for the euro bonds. And ODA has been flat for the last several decades, right? But you still need, in order to have this new growth model, you need investments, and you need to finance those investments. So how do you do that? So I offer three things, and they're not new, but they're important, and they're basically a way to make what we already know work better. So there was a lot of conversations about how do we actually make things that we know work better and at scale. So one of them is obviously the big elephant, which is the debt. If you want to finance sovereign public investments, okay, you have to really deal with the African debt issues. And there are two things to distinguish about African debt, right? So there are some countries that are obviously insolvent. So they need debt reduction. Okay? It's impossible to continue. It's impossible to imagine that they will actually come back soon, which is what we want, into positive growth territory, unless there's some form of debt reduction. There are others that are not insolvent, but they have liquidity problems because the bullet payments and all those things are pressing. Those ones just need some form of liquidity financing. I mean, that's why you have institutions like IMF, which is sort of like, an insurance against those kinds of things. But the second thing is what I think François said, which is, the second thing is that in order to be able, what is really important is cheap financing. Okay, for all these needs, massive needs in infrastructure, massive needs in health and education, especially given the demographic bulge that is coming these continents, where massive needs in, even just mitigating against the shocks that people are talking about, like climate and conflict and all those things. You need massive investments. In order to do that, build state capacity, you need concessional financing, cheap financing. And that requires, thinking about strengthening existing instruments for concessional financing and making them bigger and larger. And then the final thing is how so one is debt reduction, the other one is actually how to provide cheap financing to sovereigns so that they don't go and borrow expensive, short maturity financing from either the domestic or international market, or at least minimize that. So there's no way you could completely stop doing that, but at least minimize that so that doesn't actually create. And the reason why we want debt reduction is because this is not going to be the last time we're going to see debt problems, right? We need a sovereign mechanism, a mechanism for resolving debt, debt issues. We have G20 that has not worked, G20 framework, but at least there was some thinking about actually considering a mechanism for resolving sovereign debt. So one way forward is to actually think about a mechanism, tweak the mechanism design of the G20 and make that work so that it is faster, it's much more meaningful in terms of giving debt reduction. Now, the final thing is, of course, solving the problem that the late Robert Lucas actually posed, which is, why does capital not flow from capital-rich countries to countries that are capital poor but capital scarce and potentially have high returns? Okay, and there are all kinds of theories out there and empirical estimates about why that is the case. But one of the things is always, of course, risk. Okay, so whether it is perceived or real, there is always this concern that, in fact, the risk levels are very high. And so one way to mitigate that risk is through guarantees. And so one of the things that the World Bank has been working very hard to do in its reform process is to actually increase the scale of guarantees. So right now, the World Bank does something close to about 7 billion guarantees for a portfolio of about 30 billion investments, okay? Now, what they want to do, what the World Bank wants to do is to increase that issuance to about 20 billion a year. At a ratio of 1 to 6 leverage, that will be $120 billion new, well, at least financing from private sector especially, to finance off-grid investments, water and sanitation, and so on and so on and so on, right? So that's the plan. Whether that will work or not is to be tested, but at least there is some way of thinking about making things that we know be simpler, faster, okay, and doing them at scale, okay? So those are the three things that I think are fairly well known, but could potentially work to increase financing from international development agencies. Let me stop here.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. Just perhaps one question to get back to the question of concessional finance and debt. In a sense, isn't it part of the debt problems that we see actually is the fact that there were very low interest rates and it was easy for developing countries to borrow. And so if we ask for more concessional debts and a higher level of concessionality, isn't there a risk that we will perpetuate these debt issues? And that was François was mentioning at the beginning of his intervention. How would you address these elements when you said we need more concessional debts?
Well, the escalation of intensification of debt problem is not because of concessional loans, right? It's because of the non-concessional loans that has actually escalated debt, but right? In a way, even there is no escaping the fact that you still need to have really, really prudent debt management, obviously, right? But if you are to choose between high-cost debt and low-cost debt, what would you choose, right? I mean, it's a very basic, obvious thing, right? So Especially, and you can even make it possible that you increase the maturity rates. Right now, they're 30, 40 years, go 50, right? What's to stop that? Now, François is completely right. So how long can the rest of the world finance these kinds of debt? But if you really care about transformation, then obviously that is, if you really want to think about transfer of cheap capital to countries that really desperately need cheap capital, that's the surest way of doing it. There's really no ambiguity there.
François, I'm playing the devil advocate, so I'll let the experts answer the question. Just very quickly before Richard, I give you the floor.
To some extent, Andrew, the issue is the difference between debt to GDP and debt service to GDP. One of the problems with more concessional loans, the debt service to GDP may remain fine, but the debt over GDP will be increasing. So the issue is to know what the market is looking at. Are we sure that the market is only looking at debt servicing rather than the total debt? I'm not clear about this. I mean, the debt over GDP ratio is so popular everywhere that I think it is a problem.
Absolutely. I agree that I think the most important thing we should be looking at is debt service to revenues. That's what we should be looking at, right? So that's what's most informative. But a lower, you know, the reason why the current debt crisis, if you really look at it, is because when the interest rates in rich countries went up, right, then debt service costs really escalated. So if you basically have low interest rate loans that are not sensitive to those interest rates, right, because that's what most, for example, IDA loans are, then you're probably safe. A lot of countries that have not borrowed from Eurobond, even though their debt to GDP ratios are high, their debt service to revenues has actually been very low, and they've been fine and safe. So that's the important thing to remember.
Great, thanks a lot. Richard, you have been very patient listening to this discussion. Sorry. Thanks a lot for your patience. The floor is yours now. What's your take on this perspective?
Thank you. I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm the last person on the last panel on the last day of this conference. So you are all, I'm quite sure, fairly exhausted. But let me begin by thanking the organizers of this exciting event, really, in this wonderful setting. I think there's been a lot of interesting ideas thrown out and discussed, most of it forward-looking. I want to be backward-looking, to begin with at least, in what I have to say, because if we were gathered here 80 years ago on the 12th of July 1944, we would be looking at whatever our equivalent of the mobile phone was back then to try and understand what was going on 6,000 miles across the Atlantic in the mountains of New Hampshire, to understand what the great and the good gathered at Bretton Woods, because the Bretton Woods conference took place in the first 3 weeks of July in 1944, were trying to do to deal with the new architecture that we are still talking about 80 years later. And I think you kind of know what the objective of Bretton Woods was. It was an attempt to design a set of new policies, a set of rules, a set of mechanisms that would stop the world going back to the economic mayhem and chaos of the interwar period, and to ensure countries had sufficient policy and fiscal space to be able, first of all, to recover from the shocks of the 30s and the dislocation of war, and then to have a sufficiently stable environment in which they could build the livelihoods that people in the post-war era were expecting. And the IMF was set up essentially to manage a stable exchange rate and to deal with balance of payment shocks. In that context, the World Bank was essentially established to provide a more stable source of patient capital, essentially initially to developed countries, but then subsequently to developing countries on the sidelines, not in the Bretton Woods conference, because trade was too contentious an issue to be discussed in Bretton Woods. That was shunted down to another UN conference on trade and employment, to discuss, and from which eventually emerged the GATT, which was an institution that would essentially manage a liberalization and opening up of the trading system in a more orderly fashion. When I try and kind of understand the system and what it was trying to do, most people either turn to what Keynes was saying or what Harry Dexter White was saying, because the Bretton Woods conference was very much a battle between the rising hegemon that was then, or the risen hegemon that was then the United States, and the declining hegemon that was Great Britain. The person I like to turn to is Henry Morgenthau, who was the chair of the Bretton Woods Conference and the US Treasury Secretary in 1944. And he had to go, once they'd all agreed to the design of these institutions, he had to go to the US Congress, because the Congress had the right to turn down what was agreed to at Bretton Woods. He had to go there and justify the outcome that had been negotiated amongst member states over that 3-week period. And it's a very nice piece that people don't read of Morgenthau's presentation to the money and what was then I think it was called the Banking and Currency Committee of the House of Representatives, that he had to defend the outcome to. And it's a very clear piece that Morgenthau presented about why the Bretton Woods institutions was good for the American people, because they had to endorse it, and why it was good for the world. And he had 3 things that he identified as being the outcome of Bretton Woods that he wanted to flag. The first one was, of course, that it was a set of institutions that would prevent beggar-my-neighbor policies, austerity, deflation, exchange rate conflict, devaluation, that had all been a feature of the chaos of the interwar period. So it was an anti-austerity agenda that Morgenthau believed that was being created in Bretton Woods. It would be a reliable source of what he referred to as international public finance. The crisis of the interwar period was a crisis of private finance, and you needed a supply of long-term, stable finance, and he thought that would have to come from public sources. And the third one was that, and it gets neglected, he wanted to prevent what he called bullying of big states, by big states of little states. He was conscious that he didn't want the system to be seen to be run by big states imposing conditionalities on smaller states. Now, I would argue that the record, although we refer to the 30 years after Bretton Woods as the French call it la Trenteuse Glorieuse, le Trente Glorieuse. We call it the Golden Age in English. I don't think the record is as glorious or golden as we tend to suggest, particularly for developing countries. As they became independent, they found a system in which the rules of the game were not really dealing with their problems in the way that they hope. But regardless of that, the system was essentially blown out of the water in the 1970s by a mixture of Richard Nixon inflationary pressures on the supply and demand side, and a major recession in the advanced economies at the end of the decade, and of course a debt crisis in the global south. And a very different system emerged to manage the global economy when the old system and the problems of the old system had essentially been supplanted by a new way of organizing the international economy. And it was not the same as the old system. I mean, for me at least, and the work that we've done in UNCTAD, the old system was an attempt really to kind of, the institutions was responsible for managing the stability of the international economy in its various dimensions. The system that emerged after the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, was a system that essentially was aimed at enabling private capital. And those are very different types of systems that one has to understand. And, I mean, we've heard a lot, I think, about the nature of the system that has emerged over the last 30 years. We've struggled to kind of define what it is, I think. Ben Bernanke has referred to it as the Great Moderation, a system of low growth but stable growth, low inflation, It's not a description I find particularly persuasive, not least because it's been a system that has been marked by extreme financial shocks of one kind or another, beginning in Latin America in the early 1990s with Argentina, with the Mexican tequila crisis, repeated in East Asia at the end of the 90s, the Russian bond crisis, and of course culminating in the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008. So it hasn't been a very stable system. It's also been a system that has been, as I think we've all talked about today, dependent on debt, a heavily debt-dependent system. And that system has proved to be very fragmented, to be very polarizing, to be highly unequal in terms of the economic outcomes that have emerged from that. And we're now trying to stitch that system together, not only dealing with the problems that it's created, but on top of that, dealing with the climate crisis. And I don't think we have a system that is fit for purpose in terms of being able right now to deal with these combined crises. So let me just leave you with 4 reforms that we think and that we've tried to push in UNCTAD that are needed to deal with this system that is highly unequal and highly crisis prone. And I think there are issues that have been talked about already before. One is the more effective use of special drawing rights. This is an old issue, goes back to the 1960s, 1970s. And whether we can use the SDRs as more than a liquidity provisioning tool and use it for longer term financing. It used to be called the link problem back in the 1970s. We haven't yet found a solution, but we need to find a way of being able to use SDRs in that way and to allocate them on a more regular basis. Everyone knows that the US Treasury has veto power over the scale of special drawing rights. We somehow need to overcome that political obstacle to the use of SDRs if they're going to serve the purpose that we think is necessary in terms of enhancing access to financial resources. There needs to be the capital enlargement question that I'm not going to repeat here, that was talked about this morning, and other things. But I think Erik's point is incredibly important. We talk a lot about public-private partnerships in this world. We don't talk enough about public-public partnerships, because there's a huge amount of opportunity from combining the $23 trillion worth of assets that are under public financing institutions' control. And that's an area that really does need, I think, much more attention in the way that I think Erik talked about. Capital flow management needs to be talked about more seriously. It's now part of the IMF agenda. A world of highly mobile, highly volatile, highly speculative capital is not one that produces a stable investment climate. And capital flow management needs to be developed in a more effective way. And finally, it's an old UNCTAD argument, we need a sovereign debt workout mechanism. We've been arguing it since the 1980s. It's been ignored. The crisis is still with us. It's getting worse. We need to take this problem much, much more seriously. It's not a liquidity crisis anymore. It's a development crisis. When governments are spending more on servicing their debt than they do on education or on health, or in many countries on both education and health. UNCTAD estimated that 3 billion people live in countries where their governments are servicing debts at a higher level than they are on spending on either health or education. This is a development crisis, and we need a mechanism that was never put in place in the discussions in Bretton Woods to deal effectively with with countries that are under debt distress. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And I think your comment shows that we need more of UNCTAD these days, not less. Thanks a lot. I'm opening the floor for questions. Perhaps just as I'm doing so, if you want to take your interactive app and answer the question whether the MDBs and the MDB system has been innovative enough or not. You can answer these questions, and in the meantime, I was told I'm allowed to take 2 questions before we wrap up. So 1 question here, yes.
Thank you very much. I think this is really a very interesting discussion and wraps up what we've been talking since yesterday. A couple of quick questions. I'll build up from what you, the moderator, started saying about the not only multiplicity, multidimensional crisis that we're living in at the moment, and Richard's historical analysis. It appears from what he said that the financial architecture, international financial architecture that was established about 80 years ago and then modified since the 70s is, to my conclusion, is no longer capable of meeting the needs of poorest countries. And we are at the center, we're talking about the New South. African countries are among countries that are left behind. And we've heard the amount of debt they have. So are we saying then that perhaps we need a rethinking of the international financial architecture, given the fact that we're living in a different world now, different world. Global crisis is not just simply financial crisis, it's economic crisis, health came into it. There are a number of conflicts everywhere, migration. It's a different world. And we're also talking about climate change with huge amount of financial needs. This is the first one. The second one, Richard talked about sovereign, what is it? What did he say? The debt, sovereign debt management. How about the idea of bringing back the HIPC initiative? Because the level of debt now in African countries, let's face it, is something that they will not be able to pay back. And the growth we're talking about will not happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was another question here.
Yeah, my quick question is very brief. On issue related with debt, shouldn't we take a bold proposition? The whole debt should be cancelled in Africa, because this is a major obstacle to kick off any growth potential. And the second point to François is classifying in climate fund and development fund. Does it make any sense when we know that advanced economies are not putting money even for loss and damage fund, and also they are reducing also aid package to developing countries? So the real problem is not being committed and not being able to take differentiated responsibility. So what difference will it make classifying into two?
30 seconds for the last question, and then you'll all have 1 minute each for wrap up.
So quickly, on the famous Lucas paradox, why does not capital flow from the north to the south? You said that there is because of a risk, and climate change is part of this risk, and this is not only a local risk but a global one. And there's still beyond this risk, so you have a risk premium. There's still a structural factor related to and finish. So you have lack of human capital, infrastructure, and institutions. Just saying that. We know that FDI is particularly sensitive to the quality of institutions. So is that FDI issue down? And a last point is, we saw during the COVID that there have been a new allocation of a special drawing right. Could it be a new? Could we open this possibility in the near future toward climate infrastructure and so on? Thank you.
So, to answer these questions and final comments, you have less than 1 minute each, and I'll go in reverse order. Richard, with the microphone.
Yeah, obviously the allocation in response to the COVID shock was has opened up a new discussion around SDRs. It's not a concluded discussion, but it's certainly, I mean, there's a lot more innovative thinking going on around the use of SDRs than was true 5 years ago, and that's a good thing. You know, we still have the problem of recycling SDRs. That was talked about in the session earlier than that, earlier in the conference. More work is needed, but it's a positive step forward without a shadow of a doubt. I mean, the problem behind it is the quota system. We know the problems with SDRs, but I think that was very positive. A HIPC initiative, I mean, I don't know. All I know is that the innovations that have taken place so far have not worked. The common framework has not worked. Collective action clauses, which we've supported for a long time in UNCTAD and bond contracts, have helped. They're not solving the problem. So we need to think a little. We've got to think out. If we're going to solve this problem, we do have to think outside the box.
We have to think differently.
And we're not doing that yet.
Andrew?
Quickly, so are we rethinking the international financial crisis? Yes, because that thinking has already started. In fact, the World Bank has an evolution roadmap that has been, been in discussions for a year and plus now. I think the rest of the MDBs are also going through that, so that's already underway. HIPC and sovereign debt workout. To restart that process will take a lot longer than to try and redesign the mechanism that we've already had. In fact, there is the G20 already have acknowledged that, in fact, there needs to be a sovereign debt resolution mechanism, right? That's the first acceptance that, in fact, we do need a workout. So the question now is, okay, you have this workout. You've said that you're going to have this framework, but your framework is actually badly designed. Okay, so can we just have a better design of that system, right? That is faster, that has clear processes, that has clear parameters, and that has a third-party resolution, that can resolve these problems if, in fact, the two counterparties don't agree, right? So that kind of mechanism design will probably be better.
Thanks, Andrew.
Well, just quick. So the Lucas problem, right? So yes, institutions are important, but the risk is not just climate. There are all kinds of risks, right? Political risk, conflict risks, all kinds of risks. So I think it's really important to have, an acceptance that, in fact, risks are multidimensional, that people are always concerned with.
Thank you very much. Erik?
No, so in my presentation, I focused on the upside, but I think if you look at the vulnerabilities in many emerging and developing countries now, we need to think about the lessons from COVID. You will see that rich countries managed very well to kind of stimulate themselves out, and there's very little scarring. Most of the scarring is now in emerging and developing economies. My concern is that when going forward, with more frequent nature and climate-related crises and shocks, that we need to focus on resilience. Adaptation is part of that. I think without that, it will be very difficult to benefit from the upside. So we need to focus much more on that. And I think something along the lines of HIPC is, because this debt is a part of the vulnerabilities of these economies. If we cannot solve that issue, I think COVID offered an interesting opportunity, because, of course, when any of these kind of debt forgiveness has to be related to something that you don't think will be, it will at least be some time before you have a similar event, and so it's one time and not again. I think that's the issue that the HIPC type initiatives are facing. If we have to find that opportunity that allows markets then to come back in after a HIPC type of arrangement. So and SDRs, I think that there's a lot of opportunities to use SDRs, and I think we are just at the beginning of understanding what can be achieved with that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. François, the last words.
Yes, on the debt, maybe I'm naive, but I'm still believe that the distinction between illiquidity and insolvency is making sense, and that it can be used in trying to resolve existing debt problems in several African countries. On the issue of the advanced countries would not contribute anything, this is not true. I mean, they are contributing already ODA. They intended, even though I believe that they didn't do it, but they were in agreement with providing $100 billion climate financing. And the issue of the public good is such that it will be very, very difficult for anybody to resist that. We'll see what happens in the COP29 in Azerbaijan, but I believe that, yes, something will come out. And about the loss and damage, it took a long time, but if I understood well, the decision was taken in the COP28 to create the loss and damage fund. Now, we still have to wait until this is becoming real. But as I said in my presentation, I said assuming that this will come, and also I insisted on the fact that it would take some time. And finally, I'm a bit surprised by the Lucas paradox, because I saw that for many reasons, we know that the Lucas paradox is much less important than what Lucas said at the beginning of his very famous paper.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. The results of the polls about whether we are innovative enough is probably that we are not. I mean, we're trying to be innovative, but I think in view of the challenges, we have to be much better. Yes, thank you for showing the results. So I think it is the honors for all of us, and I would like to thank the panelists for trying to come up with innovative solutions and thinking. And I would like to thank the Policy Center for the New South for this opportunity to share these views and to exchange on these very important issues. Thank you very much all.